right, let's officially get started. All right, we're going to move right along to our next form, which is our solar advisory and questionnaire. This form, I get lots of questions regarding solar. Most of the time I ask if the seller has provided this solar form, and most buyer's agents say no, they have not. So I tell them to start by requesting this form. So this form should be provided on all listings that have a solar power system on them. Okay, so all properties with solar should have this solar form. It's actually called SOLAR, and it's the solar advisory and questionnaire. It's going to get dated as the date that the form's completed, right? And then solar ownership. Solar power systems may be owned outright, owned with financing, owned with a lien or security interest in the real property, or leased. Many property owners who believe that they own their solar power system may not have free and clear ownership of that system. Ownership could be subject to a note or deed of trust issued when the solar power system was financed, or a UCC-1 financing statement filed with the California Secretary of State. Financing of the solar power system may also be secured by an assessment against the real property that is collected through additional property tax payments. If that's the case, run far. Don't, no, I'm joking. I'll talk about that in a minute. For the period of financing, that would be either a HERO loan or a PACE loan. Because the seller's property tax statement will reference the solar lien, sellers may not remember the lien or consider it as a separate lien. Nonetheless, it should be disclosed. Some owners obtain private lending to purchase a solar power system that is not secured by real property or panels or other equipment attached to it. If the seller is intending for these private loans to be paid off as part of the sale, terms may need to be added to the agreement. That would be the purchase agreement to address the situation. Okay, if it's got a HERO or PACE loan, what happens is instead of being a separate payment, it's lumped in as part of your property taxes. Those get really messy come the close of escrow, because what happens is even if you're going to pay that loan off at the close of escrow, you can get a payoff statement from the lender. You can pay off that loan, but if the property tax bill has already been issued for the year, your property taxes are not current unless you pay that portion of the property taxes. So in essence, they're going to get double paid. Okay. In the case that something is double paid, because what happens is you can't get that property tax bill adjusted once the bill has been issued. You have to pay off the loan. You have to pay your property taxes. You need to stay in connection with that seller, because more than likely some of the money that got paid at the property taxes, it's going to get reimbursed back to the current owner of the property, which is going to be the buyer. Some of those funds may belong to the seller. Some of them may belong to the buyer based on when they take ownership of it. So just know that that's going to be an issue. You may want to work out what that prorated amount is going to be of what portion belongs to the seller versus the buyer, and either ask the seller to pay for their portion in advance if they haven't paid for it yet, or get a credit to the seller if they've already paid the first property tax installment or a portion of the property taxes for the time period that is going to be before the sale date. It gets really complicated. If you guys ever have that where you come across one of these PACE or HERO loans, feel free to reach out to me. I have personal experience with them. They're a pain, but there's ways to make that transition a little easier and less confusing. If you have buyers or property owners that are asking you about financing energy efficient upgrades to their property, I would recommend to you that recommend that they don't use a HERO or PACE loan. Okay, they're a pain. They can do any other type of financing besides those two, because those two actually attach themselves to the property taxes. All right. 2, solar liens, power purchase agreements, and solar leases. Many solar power systems are not owned, but instead leased. When a lease system typically has a fixed or scheduled monthly payment, other systems may have a power purchase agreement requiring the purchase of all or portion of the solar power generated at an agreed contractual rate from the solar company, with the ability to sell any excess energy to the electrical provider company. That would be something like PG&E. In accordance with the solar company, let's try that again. In accordance with the The system's governing regulatory scheme. Payments under such agreement can vary depending on the amount of energy created and used. Even solar power systems that are leased may have security interests attached, such as a UCC-1 or fixed filing record in the county where the property is located. So it's saying, hey, some properties, some panels aren't owned. Okay, they're leased, which means you don't actually own the panels. You're paying a lease payment each year, each month to the company. At the end of that lease, they may give you the option to purchase those panels, or they may give you the option to pay off or that would be the purchase, or they may take the panels back. Okay, those are your two options with the lease system. And then the second thing that it's talking about, a power purchase agreement, we're not seeing those as frequently anymore, but you do still see them. And what that is let's say a company like Vivint comes and puts solar panels on your house. Okay, they still own those solar panels. They still maintain those solar panels. The energy produced from those panels actually still belongs to Vivint. They're just using your house. In in response to allowing them to use your house for solar panels, what they do is they negotiate a reduced rate with PG&E for the power, which means you're still paying for all the kilowatt hours that you use. It just may not be, instead of at, I don't even know what PG&E is right now, let's say it's 43 cents a kilowatt hour, you might have a negotiated rate of 20 cents per kilowatt hour. So if it's a power purchase agreement, that's how that works, is that you're just paying a reduced rate for the power that you use for the most part. Okay. In some cases, the lender or lien holder for that solar power system may allow a buyer to assume the existing loan and may agree to allow the solar lien to subordinate to or become secondary to a new purchase loan. It's going to have to, if your buyer's going to take on a solar payment loan, right? They're going to assume an existing loan. Your current lender, your new lender that's doing the purchase loan for that property is going to require it to become secondary to their new purchase loan. However, in many cases, the holder of the security interest will not release the priority of its security interest, which means that the solar loan must either be paid off when the property is sold or that a buyer must purchase without obtaining any new financing. That'd be purchase the house without obtaining new financing. More and more solar providers are getting better at resubordinating the loan to the new lender. We're not seeing that cause as many problems as it did at the beginning. Where there is a solar lease, a buyer may be permitted to assume the terms of the solar lease, but only with the approval of the solar company. For lease systems, there may be a provision enabling the purchase of the solar power equipment prior to the end of the lease term, or a provision allowing the termination of the lease at cost with no retained ownership of the solar equipment, a buyout. There may also be a clause enabling the purchase of the equipment or the termination of the lease without any pre-agreed cost. In those cases, the cost will be an appraised value determined by the solar company. If a solar power system is owned by the seller may have the right to remove the system or its components or install them on another property. If the system has been financed and the financing is secured by a lien on the property or a component parts, the seller should consult with the company about both the effect and removal of the system or its components on the lien and the consequence of any damage caused by removal. So, right, so seller owns the system, they can take it with them. Anytime there's solar power on a property that you're going to make an offer on, I make sure to write it into that purchase agreement. Make sure to check the box for the solar power system. That way we make sure that it retains with the property. Okay, we want it to stay with the property. If the seller does choose to remove it, or your buyer doesn't want it and seller wants to take it with them, they have the right to do that. Just know that there have been holes drilled into the roof of that house. We need to make sure it's watertight. So after the removal of the solar equipment, you probably want to have it inspected by a roofer to make sure that it is watertight. Advertising material. All parties are advised that the multiple listing service and other advertisements that are used to list and market a property for sale are not contractual agreements. Thus, it is imperative that buyers of a property with a solar power system receive and carefully review copies of old documents, including any solar agreement, underlying security agreements for owned equipment, or any other material that the seller possesses prior to the buyer making any final decision regarding the solar power system. Buyers should not simply rely on the information in the MLS or any other advertising material. You should get copies of the lease that you're thinking about assuming, of the purchase agreement if you're taking over those payments, or the original installation agreement if the system is owned outright. Okay, we want to know what the kilowatt hours are, what the agreements are, who maintains it, what if a panel breaks, is there a warranty on it, all of those things. So you should get those original documents and original paperwork. Not only that, it's probably going to talk about that here in a second, but there's usually a transfer fee associated with transferring the solar power system to the new owner that gives them the access to access the websites and such to monitor its production, make sure all the panels are working, all that stuff that you have access to. All right. 4 is the purchase contract and transfer issues. The car purchase agreements include a contingency for the review of lease items and systems. That would cover whether the item was owned or if it's just got a lien against the property. In order for the buyer to review any agreements or documents related to any solar power system and the property and properly evaluate all of the present and future terms and conditions, including the cost of accepting existing solar power system, the default language provides that the system is being transferred and that a buyer has a contingency to determine whether the buyer is willing to assume any lease, lien, or other agreement. If the solar power system is not intended to be transferred with the property, the contract may need to be modified to address this. Okay, just some things to keep in mind there. Keep in mind that under that leased and liened items, the seller is required to provide copies of those contracts to the buyer, and the buyer doesn't have to remove that contingency until they have received copies of those contracts. If it's within 5 days prior to removal, the due date of the contingency for leased and liened items, then the buyer needs to remove that contingency on time. If the seller delays in getting copies of those, so if you have a seller, you've got solar, get copies of their contracts before you go on the market. Provide those up in your HomeLight listing management file, because if we delay in getting those to a buyer, let's say their contingency is due tomorrow and we get them those documents today, that buyer has another 5 days to review those documents without having to extend their contingency, and they're still not in breach of contract. All right. If a leased or lien system to be assumed by buyer, the solar company may take steps to ensure its priority interest against the property, or the buyer's lender may require the solar endorsement from the title company. If this occurs, escrow could be delayed. Buyers and sellers should be aware that because any buyout or assumption of solar power could impact closing escrow, they should consider including a provision in the purchase agreement to allow for the possible extension of the closing date to facilitate dealing with any problems that may arise because of the solar power system. Solar evaluation, recommendations, and legal advice. Real estate brokers and their agents are not qualified to evaluate the terms, conditions, and/or security interests in a solar power system. They are also not qualified to determine the quality of solar equipment or the impact of any regulatory scheme on the ownership or use of solar equipment. Buyers and sellers of solar property should consider retaining the services of a solar photovoltaic system inspector if one is available in the area where the property is located. I highly recommend you track some of these down and have a list of people that you can refer. Anytime we refer somebody, we should look for 3 to refer. Brokers recommend that sellers and buyers of a solar property exercise diligence in obtaining copies of contracts, agreements, and other documents related to any possible solar power system security interest as soon as practical to enable a prompt evaluation of what may be required to facilitate the sale of the property. So anytime you have a property that has solar, I highly recommend you open pre-escrow on that property to make sure that what's recorded against the property. I can't tell you the number of times that we've had sellers say, oh yeah, we have solar, but it's totally paid off. You pull a copy of that prelim, it is not paid off, or it was not cleared from the title of the property if it was paid off, which means now we need to show proof that it was paid off to get that cleared. So open pre-escrow. Additionally, obtaining a buyout or obtaining any agreement for a buyer to assume the solar agreement may take considerable time and or be of uncertain cost. Therefore, sellers of solar property should, prior to entering into a purchase agreement, determine if a buyout or loan assumption is available and at what cost or terms, so as to make full and complete disclosure to a potential buyer and avoid delays in the close of escrow. Just so we know too, if you're going to assume financing on a leased or liened item, that does become part of the contract qualifying for those items. Whether or not a solar system inspector is used, buyers and sellers should consult with a qualified California real estate attorney prior agreement to purchase or sell solar property. That attorney should evaluate the existing solar documentation and properly craft language to be included in the purchase agreement that will best protect the interests of their clients. Real estate brokers and their agents are not allowed to prepare standard real estate transaction documents, but they are not qualified to create specialized contract language that may be needed to deal with specific issues involved in any specific solar property. So page 1 of our solar form is the disclosure about solar powered systems and how they work and what to look for when transferring. Page number 2 is a bunch of questions that have to be answered by sellers. Oftentimes, I believe this form can be sent out through a system called Glide, Glide. You can access it through your Barry's login, useful tools. We have access to Glide. It allows you, when you have forms like this that have yes, no questions, to be sent to the seller. It'll ask them 1 or 2 of those questions at a time. If they answer yes to any of the questions, it will prompt them for an explanation, and it will fill out this form completely in its entirety as it should be filled out. If we don't use Glide, we try to send this through like DocuSign or Authentisign. Oftentimes our sellers, they don't mark all the boxes. They don't fill in explanations. If you do this in person, your sellers are going to ask you questions that you really truly don't know the answer to and should not be answering. And then you're going to be the one answering this form, not them, which, as you'll learn next week, is not okay. So there we go. Here's our question. Solar property questionnaire. If yes to any question, provide an answer. Yep.
So why did you say it's the best way to send the form to them?
I like sending things through Glide that have questions and answers because it ensures each one gets answered appropriately and each explanation is given for a yes.
Okay.
All right. General solar power, obviously, if your seller's not tech savvy, then you may have to provide it to them in person. I try to drop it off with them. I'll say, hey, I'll drop off those disclosures, and then I'll come back, the next day or 2 days later to pick them up from you. That way, it doesn't put me at risk of feeling bad and answering questions for my sellers. Another good thing to include with anything that you've got questions on or disclosure information advisory form, or DIA, which walks the seller through everything that should be disclosed. All right, general solar power system issues. Are you, the seller, aware of the approximate age of the solar power system, right? If it's yes, you're going to put how old it is. Name of installation company. Does the solar power system provide power for only a portion of the property? Approximate size of the system, like number of panels or kilowatt size. Whether the system is a central inverter or micro inverters, whether the system is on grid only or on and off grid or off grid only, whether there's a battery bank or power wall that enables the system to run off grid, whether any portion of the system is installed anywhere other than the roof. Let's see here. Regardless of whether the solar power system is owned, leased, subject to a power purchase agreement, any transfer fee or other fee for change of ownership. Whether there is a maintenance agreement for the solar power system and any material facts or information related to that solar power system. So remember, it's just saying, hey, seller, are you aware of any of these? And if they mark the box yes, that they're aware of that, they are aware of the age, they're aware of the installation company, they're aware of whether or not there is a battery bank, right? Then they're going to put in an explanation down here. The second section, B, if applicable, owned solar power systems that are conveyed with the property. So this is one for a owned system. Okay, it doesn't have to be owned outright. It doesn't have to be paid off, but is it owned versus leased? So if it's owned, we're going to answer the questions in B. Whether the system still has a balance due on financing. If yes, what is the balance? What is the monthly payment? If yes, is it secured by interest on title? So is it recorded against the title of the property? And if yes, is the loan transferable or assumable by the buyer? If it is not secured on title, the agreement may have to be amended for the buyer to be responsible for the balance, okay? Whether there is an annual true-up bill for the solar company. Okay, most solar systems have what they call a true-up bill, which means that each month PG&E bills me the minimum amount that they can do, which is about $10 a month. If I generated enough power to cover my usage for that month, then I get a credit in my true up bank. And if I used more power than I generated, then I get a fee in my true up bank. And at the end of a 12-month period, I get billed for PG&E for any amount that didn't balance out by the end of the year. At any time during their billing, they are able to see what their true up currently stands at. So if it's month 7 of their year since they got solar installed, they can look at their PG&E bill and see what their current true up is. Okay, super important. I usually request a 12-month history of PG&E bills if I have a seller that has solar on their property, because that gives the buyer an idea of what the solar is generating on a monthly basis. And sometime in that 12-month period, generally speaking, they had a true up bill so they can see what that is. So it's asking that question there. What is the approximate bill amount? Again, they can get that off their PG&E bill. Whether there is any type of lien or encumbrance on title on a property tax bill or otherwise, and if there is a power purchase agreement. Okay, and then explanations. Now, if there is a power purchase agreement, technically you probably don't own the panels, but we'll just scoot on to the next section. So this is for leased solar power systems or systems with power purchase agreements, which again is that reduced cost to PG&E for the electricity that you use. The name of the company with the lease or power purchase agreement, are you aware of that? If so, what is it? What year does the agreement expires? Are you aware of that, which year it is and when is that? The current solar payments, what is that amount? Whether the payments are fixed or vary over the life of the agreement. It's not uncommon, especially for like a power purchase agreement. The rate goes up a little bit each year. Whether the lease or power purchase agreement is transferable or assumable by buyer. Whether the solar power system is into the agreement. If not owned, can the equipment be purchased? If yes, what is the estimate that would be owned at the end of that? So your seller needs to fill out all of those forms. Now, the other thing to be aware of, 99% of the time, I would say, on solar systems, whether they're owned or leased, there's going to be what's called a private transfer fee. It doesn't ask about that in here. Most of the time there is one. So on the purchase agreement, there's a little box that we rarely ever deal with, which is that private transfer fees. Who's going to pay for those? I would absolutely mark that box for either the buyer or seller for somebody to take responsibility for private transfer fees, which is where this would fall under. Any questions about this solar advisory and questionnaire? All right. And again, remember, this form should be included with each and every listing that has solar attached to it. All right. Fabulous. That brings us to the end of our forms for today. I hope that was useful. I hope you feel a little bit more comfortable using some of these forms that we don't see on a regular basis and using some of the forms that we should be seeing more regularly that we're not seeing on a regular basis to make those part of your regular practice. If you guys have any questions, holler at me again next week. We'll be here at 9 o'clock. We have our staying out of court with Robert Brand. He's fabulous. Join us for that one. It'll be on Zoom. And hold on, I've got something in the chat box. Oh, if you want to suggest a training, we're getting ready to put together our fall training schedule. There's a link in the chat box you can click on to make recommendations of trainings that you would like to see. Watch for a survey to come out in the Facebook group. It may also come out via text as well, asking for what days and times you prefer for trainings, so that as we put together the new schedule, we try to accommodate as many people as possible. Thanks everyone for joining me today, and have a fabulous day. We'll see you next week.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely.